So hello again, welcome to S&OP Vendor Day, live, still in the Netherlands. It has been an exciting day. It's a hybrid event, so we have an audience, a bigger audience than we used to have in the last 18 months. So that's a good point. The flip side is it's hybrid, so we are online. We had some internet difficulties on our side, on the US side, so that's that's difficult. So next, Lora Cecere will talk us through why S&OP is so difficult. And we seem to live in a digital age, but as we have seen, internet is already difficult, let alone S&OP. We will hear from Lora. She's from Supply Chain Insight, one of the greatest analysts, if not the greatest analyst in supply chain matters, in my opinion. Ex-Gartner, ex-AMR. She's doing a lot of research, and then she's what she's calling herself a planning gal. So I would say, Lora, tell us why supply chain planning and especially S&OP is so difficult. Lora, floor is yours.
It's so good to be here, and I'm so sorry for the technical problems. I've been following sales and operations planning as an industry analyst for 2.5 decades, and an industry analyst is trying to help people with the questions they should ask, whereas a consultant knows the answers. So what I've been doing is primary research and triangulation on business results and looking at the choices that people make and what makes things work and when companies go backwards. And in the last decade, unfortunately, we've gone backwards in our ability to drive cross-functional process excellence to be able to drive business results. And that worries me, and I'm going to talk about a couple of concepts, and one is the definition of supply chain excellence, because in the last decade, we made supply chain a function within other functions, and we focused on functional excellence. And we have a simplistic view of a supply chain that's become more complex. People will talk about triangles, and they'll talk about, the trade-offs between customer service and inventory and costs, and it's just not that easy. And only 9% of companies have actually designed their supply chains. And I think in this post-COVID world, we've got to say, how do we build better to drive business outcomes? So we're going to run through some slides, and because of the technical problems, I'm going to have to say next slide. So now we're going to say next slide. And so the lack of definition of supply chain excellence is at the top of the list about why is S&OP so hard. People talk about supply chain excellence, but I've worked with over 1,000 companies, and I got to tell you, a few companies have defined supply chain excellence well. Most companies will define it as functional excellence, improvement in OEE, or improvement in functional cost. But when we focus on functional metrics, we throw the supply chain out of balance. The company with the lowest transportation or the lowest manufacturing cost will not be the company with the best cost. Only 29% of companies can see total cost, and only 2% of companies can see margin. So we've really not built a system where we can really keep the supply chain in a balance. The second is the struggle with analytics. Our traditional applications put data into relational architecture, sort of like putting a guy in prison. We can't really manage the disparate data, and we don't have good planning master data systems. When we talk about master data, most people talk about transactions, but Lora Cecere, the planning gal, is going to talk about planning master data. What is the change in lead time? What is the change in conversion rate? What is the change in cycle? Because we live in a variable world, and we're still stuffing lead times that are probably the same lead times as when we implemented a system through an engine. And most of the time, we're trying to push things through an engine and then argue about imperfect data versus aligning on strategy. And then the third is process definition, and how do we drive value? What is value in our value chain? And how do we drive growth or value or sustainability? And what do we mean by those definitions? Most people will glad hand with, high-level definitions like, end-to-end supply chain excellence. We've got to be real about what these definitions are. And then the fourth is governance. What is the role of the region? What is the role of the division? What is the role of global? And how do I align on S&OP excellence? Because organizations are not aligned. And then we'll do a little wrap up. So let's get into it with our next slide. And I'm sorry I got to do this, but we had a little technical problem. So what is supply chain excellence? Just rock and roll through this slide. Most people say supply chain excellence, but they aren't clear on the meaning. Next slide. And so I do a lot of work on the supply chains to admire, and I've done this for 7 years. And we worked with Arizona State University to say, what combination of metrics will drive the highest value in market cap? And the metrics are on balance sheets: growth, margin, not cost, inventory turns, not working capital, and return on invested capital. And our choices around asset utilization will drive, or should drive, a lot of the discussion in S&OP, because S&OP is a tactical process really focused on how we manage bottlenecks. And traditionally, we've looked at management of manufacturing bottlenecks and constraints. But today we have constraints in procurement, we have constraints in transportation. So as we manage those tactical flows that are from the slush period of when we firm orders through the bottlenecks, we need to think about what drives resilience. Where are my buffers? How do I manage form and function of inventory? What drives balance? Because organizational alignment is so key. And what I have found in the last decade is the gap between commercial and operational teams has grown more and more divisive. And part of that is because we've implemented functional excellence silos, things like CRM and SRM, which there is no relationship in CRM and SRM. They're really efficient systems that are trying to help the functions be more efficient, but they've driven us out of balance. And then what is the performance? How am I doing to industry peer group? Because of 28 industries that I follow, 26 have gone backwards in performance, and most people are still measuring performance, assuming that the industries are going forward, or assuming that their systems that they have inside to drive improvement are driving results. And so we've got to really compare to peer group to look at what is the potential of that industry and how do I drive year-over-year improvement. So a good S&OP process has a great definition of supply chain excellence. Next slide. And that supply chain excellence definition ties to strategy. And if you don't get anything out of this presentation, functional silos and functional metrics drive a negative impact in our ability to drive value and our ability to really align in sales and operations planning. Functional silos, a manufacturing organization focused on OEE, a procurement organization focused on purchase price variance, will have a hard time being at the same table to drive sales and operations planning. And if you aren't holding everyone accountable at a balance sheet level on a balanced scorecard, you will struggle to drive improvement. Next slide. And so I use the balanced scorecard and the supply chains to admire of growth, margin, inventory turns, and complexity. And we're not doing a good job on inventory. You know, we entered the pandemic with 21 more days of inventory than we had at the beginning of the 2007 recession. And when you look at what's happening in inventory across the industry sectors, we should be embarrassed. Only 9% of companies design the supply chain. Most people depend upon safety stock, a very simplistic in DRP. And we really need to think about inventory as the most important buffer and the most important asset in the industry supply chain, and put energy around the design of push-pull decoupling points and buffer strategies. And the companies that do S&OP the best design the supply chain quarterly and consume the tactical plan into the design. Next slide. And so when we think about the definition of supply chain excellence, we have to think about the balance between improvement and performance. So when I first started the supply chains to admire work, I got all excited about the companies that were driving improvement the fastest. But then I looked at how they're doing in performance, and I found that the management of the supply chain is a lot like the management of your training in the gym. If you're on the left side, the guy with a little bit more of a belly, like Lora in the gym, it's easier to lose and to drive improvement. But if you've really got a lean muscle mass, it's harder to drive improvement and to drive step change. You can't just follow the pack. You've got to really invent, and you've got to drive process innovation. And one of the issues we have in the supply chain is we don't have good mechanisms for driving process innovation. We implement technology, but we don't really drive process innovation. We don't really say, do I have a good plan? Am I improving forecast value add based upon coefficient of variation? Where am I on demand segmentation? How does demand segmentation tie to customer strategy? How do I bring policy and rules together with the engines? Because our legacy systems that we've had through the advanced planning years are not adequate for what we need for improvement as we go through this COVID shift. Next slide. And so, as we look at, this whole idea of performance and improvement and industries, I use orbit charts, and you'll see me with these on LinkedIn, and you might think they're a lot like modern art. But, you see here the chemical industry, and you see a company like Ecolab and the comparison to the chemical industry. And Ecolab actually used sales and operations planning to drive a tremendous improvement in performance. Look at where they were in 2011. Look at where they ended up in 2020. Now you'll notice it's not a linear relationship to the best case scenario, but they have outperformed the chemical industry, which is their peer group, with 14% margin and 5.26 inventory turns against the chemical industry. So this is a supply chain leader. This is a company that has outperformed the industry and driven improvement. And sales and operations planning was one of the mechanisms that they used. Now, Ecolab struggled because they had a lot of people from different organizations that came together. They had people from Unilever and people from Procter & Gamble and people from DuPont and people from pharmaceuticals. And they all came with a different concept of sales and operations planning and a different concept of sales and supply chain excellence. But one of the things I'm really proud of Ecolab for was bridging the gaps organizationally and defining supply chain excellence. Alex did a great job. Next slide. Now I'm going to give you an example of a company that is not outperforming the peer group. This is AkzoNobel. And, again, if you look at the pattern, it's a very different pattern to the industry. And so when we look at sales and operations planning, we must ask ourselves, where are we against the peer group? What is the pattern, and how do I outperform, and how do I align improvement with performance so that I have the right goals for the organization and they're feasible, and that I'm balancing the tension between performance and improvement. Next slide. And so, we can keep going here. Next slide. And so, I use a simple chart. This is, just looking at an industry comparison where I'm looking at improvement using a concept that I've built called the supply chain index that looks at the vector analysis of the orbit charts. And I look at, how are we doing in aggregate over multiple years, because it takes a company 4 to 5 years to actually drive improvement. And I welcome you to adopt the methodology. I share it openly. Look at the supply chain Stoudemire, because you should ask yourself these questions. Next slide. So industries struggle with inventory. This is a little bit of inventory 101. If we look at industry performance, most people don't realize that we had so much inventory going into the pandemic. And the issue is we are not managing form and function of inventory. We need to do this quarterly, where we ask ourselves, where should inventory be held? What should the buffers be? And how do I manage all the elements of inventory in transit, cycle stock, safety stock, seasonal inventory? Most people are only managing safety stock, and what has happened with product proliferation is cycle stock management has become worse and worse over the last decade, and in-transit inventories have increased. We actually see an in-transit inventory increase right now of about 3% because of our unloading off of Long Beach and LA and all of the ports around the world. And most people are not thinking about in transit, and they're not thinking about the fact that our lead times have severely changed, and we need a planning master database underneath our APS systems or advanced planning systems that help to keep current, to manage variability and improve reliability. Next slide. And so when we look at the balanced scorecard, I want to focus on value in sales and operations planning. I want to drive alignment between the organization. I want to have simplicity in measurement. I want to have the functions focus on reliability, not OEE and manufacturing, but schedule adherence and first pass yield, not purchase price variant and procurement, but quality, supplier development metrics, on-time performance, not error and demand planning, but forecast value add based upon demand segmentation, on time, in full, and do I have the right inventory based upon the buffers and the design? When you do that in sales and operations planning, the politics fall away. If you do not do that in sales and operations planning, you will be mired in functional politics that will cause you to go backwards quickly. And if you hard code this to the budget, you will go backwards even more quickly. The budget should never be tightly coupled to sales and operations planning. Sales and operations planning should be market driven and an input into the budget and the financial process. So those companies that have tightly coupled the budget to S&OP and IBP have had a tremendous impact and negative on balance sheet results. Next slide. And so a little bit of focusing on reliability. Here are some metrics to think about as you think about functional metrics, and you think about, how do you drive reliability? Are you shaping demand or shifting demand? If you shift demand, then you're increasing cost. Reliability and on time and in full, hands-free orders. Are you able to manage those order cycles hand-free? Planning, forecast value add, coefficient of variation, first pass tender, schedule adherence, first pass yield, first pass quality, on-time materials, hands-free procurement, form and function of inventory, and first pass tender. And these reliability metrics tied to the balanced scorecard, which helps you to align in S&OP. All right, so let's keep going here. S&OP is really, really difficult if you don't drive alignment metrics, but you only drive value if you can align to business strategy. What is the market strategy? How do I drive market data? How do I align suppliers and supplier development? Only a third of companies have supplier development. Only 9% of companies are actively doing network design, and very few people have balanced scorecards. So S&OP in isolation as a process can never be successful unless you align to the market, the strategy, the supplier development, and you design supply chains and align those metrics. Okay, let's keep going. S&OP is one of my very favorite topics, but you can't get there without some level of technology. 94% of companies have advanced planning systems. 73% of companies have the dependency on forecasting in Excel spreadsheets and managing planning in Excel spreadsheets. And the reason is we have not really designed planning very well for the planners. And the ability to do what-if modeling and the ability to have a feasible plan. Most people have implemented technology for technology's sake, and they walked away and they said, I've got that project in, but they haven't asked the question of, am I driving a good plan? Do I have a feasible plan? Am I able to manage bottlenecks? Am I able to manage source, make, and deliver together? So let's look at analytics and analytics adoption. In the COVID period, what we saw was most people assumed that COVID was going to be just like another risk management event. shut down manufacturing, bolted the hatches, and assumed demand would go down, right? We had record unemployment. But no one would have ever predicted that 39% of manufacturers would have a tremendous spike in demand, more than 5%, and the 29% would have a tremendous decrease in demand. And it was like an elevator. Next slide. It was quick. It went through the roof and it went to the basement. And companies that were stuck with demand planning based on history had to turn it off. And they couldn't get to the data at the right time, and they started to really react and have a lot more meetings. And so what we have to do in sales and operations planning is we've got to connect with market drivers, point of sale data, channel data, consumption data, and redesign those architectures to be outside in. And I'm actively working with ASCM on the redefinition of outside in planning. And I would encourage everyone to follow the work we're doing in Project Zebra with ASCM, where we're looking at how do we redesign planning so we can get data in a more timely fashion that does not just represent traditional order patterns, but represents market and decreases demand latency. The pilot that we've been working on is BSH. BSH makes wonderful dishwashers, and they had a tremendous outage during the pandemic. They had to turn off demand planning, and because history was not a good representation of demand, the market signal was 4 months ahead of BSH. They could have seen the need for allocation. Their time to respond was 3 months. Their demand latency from the consumption signal to the order was 2 weeks. But they were on the back foot. They didn't allocate quick enough. They couldn't align quick enough because they were focused on the order. The order is not a good representative signal, and managing order patterns in variable markets are not going to drive what we need in S&OP. So we need to be outside in. We need to be able to look at how do we drive market signals from the customer's customer, the supplier's supplier. Supply chain can't be a function. Supply chain needs to be a capability to be able to get the right data, align the organization, and to drive understanding from the executive team. And the only way you're going to drive understanding of the executive team is through things like the digital twin, digital simulation, and help them to understand how the supply chain is a complex, nonlinear system that cannot be measured in a spreadsheet. Next slide. And so, companies struggle with analytics. We're not doing this very well. What people were able to use in the pandemic were descriptive analytics, right? It's ironic that we've spent so much money on technologies that were really not very usable and that we're not able to really implement analytics very well. And part of the issue is we're still caught up in that relational database paradigm where we feel like we've got to have pristine data locked into rows and columns, and that we can't use market data. Machine learning has come a long way to help us with translation of market data. The data doesn't have to be pristine anymore. We need planning master data systems. We need the ability for market data, and we need the ability for what-if simulation to drive those gaps and to close them organizationally. Next slide. And so as we think about only 9% of companies design supply chain flows, okay, I'm a chemical engineer. I couldn't get out of college without designing heat exchangers and distillation columns. I designed manufacturing plants for many years. Why are we not designing our supply chains? Why do we not look at what's happening and lead times and say, our supply chains are not feasible. What we're trying to do needs to be rethought. We don't have reliability. Our transportation logic and our traditional systems assumed that we'd have availability. We only had to negotiate price. And we don't have reliability in transportation right now. It is a larger bottleneck for most than manufacturing. So we need to design, we need to align, and we need to really focus on how we use analytics. And analytics can help us. Next slide. And so, as we look at the S&OP process, is it any wonder we went backwards? We tightly coupled to the budget. We put in traditional systems. We focused on functional metrics. and we took the results down the tank, right? We weren't ready for COVID. And in fact, the resilience factor in most industries started to wane in 2014. But because we weren't looking at industry performance, we just kept putting in the same old systems, walking the same old walk, talking the same old talk, and the decline in S&OP performance is big. Next slide. So how do you build process capabilities? Well, it starts with you. And it starts with building your team. Next slide. And you've got to say, what's value? In the first book that I wrote, I had Keith Harrison, who was head of Procter & Gamble for 20 years, supply chain. Lots of respect for Keith. And Keith said to me, Lora, you say that we have to move from cost to value, but you don't define value. It was fabulous feedback on my first book. And that started me on the quest to look at tangible book value, market capitalization, growth, but you and your organization need to define value. So when I look at the factors in companies over the last decade that correlate with tangible book value, it are companies that have a successful center of excellence where they self-rate that the center of excellence is meeting the goal. They have balance in sales and operations planning and organizational alignment. And when I say balance, I ask people to tell me, are you balanced in the decision-making between the S or the commercial teams and the OP? If you're out of balance, you're not effective. If you're not aligned, you're not effective. And then second and third tier supplier visibility and supplier development programs so that you're not just pushing cost and waste back into the supply base, but you're actually able to drive supplier reliability. These four factors correlate with value as measured by tangible book value. But to drive improvement in sales and operations planning, you must ask yourself, what is value and how do I drive value in the value chain? Next slide. And so, the best sales and operations planning systems are fit for function. They have clear goals, clear KPIs, balanced scorecards, balance in S&OP between the S and the OP, clarity of the role of the budget, never tightly couple the budget, and they're outcome-based. They're focused on how do we drive results cross-functionally, and they're very well defined based upon governance. What is the role of the region? What is the role of corporate? What is the role of a particular function? I work with a company that had 33 different divisions, and each division was responsible for their own S&OP. Now, they tightly coupled their S&OP to their budget process, and their systems were ineffective because they under-forecasted so that they made all their bonus goals, and their asset lead time was 20 months. But because they under-forecasted, they were never able to adequately plan for the future. And so they ended up losing 8% of growth opportunity. Now, that company had invested incredible amounts in IT, had really worked on training the teams. But the other thing they didn't do was they didn't look at how can they roll up the systems to be able to drive global governance. And so these are some really key factors in driving improvement and making sure that your teams can drive forward. Next slide. So the balance is not present in most companies, which is a big issue. Next slide. And also organizations are not aligned, which is also a huge issue. So when you think about how do you drive improvement, focus on balance, alignment, and governance. So Martin, those are some concepts. I think we may be out of time, may spark some questions for you.
Yeah, it is on. Thank you, Laura. There are some questions. First, from my side, I was wondering, you mentioned that relate your S&OP process to the budget is wrong. So, but why?
Right.
Because if companies are, try to implement IBP, they say, okay, you need to have a financial reconciliation, and you have your budget, and you have your gap closing actions. But in essence, you say that's wrong.
Right. That is wrong.
And why? Because
And why is that wrong? It's because the budget is at a step with the market the minute it's published. And our goal is really not to make the budget. Our goal is to drive value. A budget is a managerial exercise, and the market is very turbulent. And so you want to use S&OP as an input to the budget and budget changes, but you never want to closely couple the S&OP process with the budget. You want to couple it with the market.
In a changing world, you may outpace your budget if you are doing it in the right way. That's what you're saying.
Or you're underpace it, right? So if you look at the unpredictable demand, right? So I work with a company that makes glass, and they make glass for automotive, and they tightly coupled their S&OP process to the budget. And they decided that, in COVID, that manufacturing was not needed. They shut down all their plants, laid off all their employees. And guess what? The demand for glass went through the ceiling. They made their budget, but they lost the market.
All right.
Which would you rather have?
Yeah, outpace the market and not so much the budget. Yeah, you're right. So yeah, okay. I was wondering if you're saying something because we lost some sound. There's also a lot of questions from the audience. What is the importance of change management? It was not on your chart as the biggest challenge in S&OP. So how do you relate? Maybe it was, but what is the importance of change management? How should you apply it to implement S&OP or IBP?
Well, what is change management? So I love the Cotter model, and I love building a guiding coalition. But one of our biggest issues is unlearning. To drive forward, we must unlearn from the past to relearn, to rethink. And that is our biggest challenge. We believe that functional excellence drives supply chain excellence. We believe that tight coupling the budget will drive excellence. We believe traditional planning systems were sufficient. We believe that a strong ERP base will give us supply chain excellence. Those are not true. And so the modeling of the supply chain in a complex variable world requires us to unlearn, to be able to look at market signals and to question that the order is not representative of demand. And the biggest issue in change management is what lays in our ears, right? The traditional score model, single threads plan through source, make, and deliver does not allow us to do bidirectional orchestration. The traditional planning systems only looked at bottlenecks in manufacturing, not bottlenecks in transportation. We built global supply chains assuming transportation would always be available. We would only negotiate on price. We didn't design supply chains. We need to change all that. And we've got to question traditional paradigms. And we can't just implement technology for technology's sake.
The current global supply chain seems to be in a state of chaos, shortages in material, labor, containers, you name it. So some companies think, we sit it out and we see if we can manage it. Some others, they want to raise their prices and, reap from it. So what do you think in the current situation will help? What should be the current way of thinking in an S&OP sense?
I want people to consider to do 5 things. Build a planning master database to look at reliability and align your engines to what's happening on variability. All of our planning lead times, our cycle times are off in our systems. So we need to use analytics to look what's happening in the real world. Secondly, I want you to design your supply chains. I want you to focus on feasibility. I want you to focus on form and function of inventory. I want you to use that planning master data to say, am I managing a feasible supply chain? Because most companies chased efficient supply chains that are not effective, and they looked at inputs into manufacturing, not necessarily the reliability of transportation. And we do not have feasible supply chains today. We need to design them and build them. And then thirdly, work with suppliers, our ocean carriers, our transportation carriers, our 3PLs, our suppliers in a meaningful way, share data, build value chains. We have not done that. The people that manage our EDI systems are retiring. The companies that own our EDI systems have consolidated. We have the opportunity to build value chains on cloud-based systems that we are not pursuing because we are still very focused on inside-out processes. Fourth, call a cross-functional meeting, map all the gaps from the COVID, bring marketing, sales, procurement in the same room, and talk about the data you have and how you can better use data and how you can move cross-functionally. The supply chain cannot be a function within a functional organization and eradicate the pain. And 5, look how you build.
So we lost sound on the fifth advice. So I don't know if you hears me or not. So that's an internet issue. No. So I guess, you know, the final remark, hopefully it will be recorded, otherwise I will catch up later to close that gap in the final sense of her advice. And maybe, you know, Philip, you wanted to ask her something about our AkzoNobel data. I have the data, so we have to get back to that. So I'm sorry to say losing the connection will leave you the challenge or the question to ask her about this data. But we'll get back to that, you know, because that's important.
Lora was actually the speaker on our supply chain forum last week, and we discussed those data,
okay,
which are true, and which were our ambition for the team actually to do better as competitors.
Okay, it's nice to hear that you are on the same page and
not share the data.
Not surprised. That's quite good to see. You know, with this, I would propose to wrap up because I see some questions coming in, but I am unable to ask Lora the questions. I will do it otherwise. So with this, I would like to wrap up the whole day. It has been an exciting day on one hand, also in a technological sense. It's a bit of a challenge, but on the other hand, it was good to see a lot of people who I haven't seen in the last 18 months in person. So that's good to see you here. It's also good to see that there are hundreds of people online watching this, and probably will get some useful knowledge out of it. And I hope that as a first actual S&OP Vendor Day, it brings a new kind of event to the market, because there is a huge need for S&OP and IBP, but there are also a lot of challenges to make it work. What I hear, there are a lot of companies that have the budgets to invest, and technology is on the radar screen, but first you have to have your process right and in order. That's what Johan Smits earlier this morning from KPMG has said, and also reinforced by Lora in a massive way. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of challenges, I would say, but there's a lot of momentum, and I hope that we have supported this momentum for you here in the room and also online, that you have a better way to pitch it to your board to move forward in S&OP and IBP. Thanks a lot. This won't be the last S&OP vendor event we're going to organize, and hopefully in next year we'll have a more massive audience, and even a more massive audience online, and then we'll see you later. And we go to the lounge. I hope you enjoyed it, and I see you later. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Carousel, carousel, carousel. De muziek is alleen nog van jou en van mij.